Hi everyone. Today our group is going to present about guaranteed minimum income and how it affects labor supply. So first I'm going to go a little bit into a brief description about guaranteed minimum income and then into the goals of the policy. Guaranteed minimum income, or GMI, is a governmental policy that aims to provide every person the guarantee of a minimum income. So unlike UBI, or universal basic income, which applies to every person regardless of their income level or employment status, the GMI only provides assistance or applies to individuals who meet a certain income level criteria. So the guaranteed minimum income presents the following three characteristics. It is an income, which means that payments are made in the form of money rather than goods or services. So the income would be paid based on the currency of the country at hand. The income is also a minimum, which means that it's defined based on a certain threshold that depends on various factors like the poverty threshold at the time or prevailing wage rates, and also other socioeconomic factors like the inflation rate or employment metrics. And lastly, the income is also guaranteed, meaning that everyone is certain to have access to a minimum amount of resources. Now, moving on to the goals of guaranteed minimum income. The main goals of this policy are to reduce poverty levels and tackle income and market level inequality. Since everyone who meets a certain threshold will qualify for the GMI, there will be a more equal playing field. Another goal to highlight here is that providing a basic income may be a way to promote gender equality. So some economists argue that since women perform the majority of unpaid care work throughout the world, if they were paid even at a minimum wage for this work, global economic output would be much higher. So a minimum guaranteed income would be a way to provide women and compensate them for the essential care services that they already perform. And this would be a way to raise their standard of living because they devote a substantial portion of their time to this unpaid care work. And this would thus promote gender equality. So now moving on to Ekta, we'll talk a little bit about the history of the GMI policy.
Thanks, Neha. One of the earliest instances of the GMI in the US was the AFDC, which provided cash for families that had disabled or unemployed parents. This program was criticized for creating a disincentive to work, so it was later replaced. The US moved away from the AFDC because its requirements were becoming too broad and strained the federal budgets. There was also a point when the government required people dependent on AFDC to go through job training to avoid the disincentive to work. Currently, the US uses two programs called SSDI and SSI, which provide income for elderly and disabled adults who meet certain medical requirements. SSI provides for basic needs. In Spain, a GMI policy was allowed only in regions that were autonomous because of the widespread support it received. Portugal, communist and socialist parties tried to use GMI policies as a part of their platform, and while these policies did not pass, they gained the support of unions and religious organizations because they saw GMI as a way to alleviate poverty. In an attempt to put more restrictions on who could apply, TANF replaced AFDC in the US, and it emphasizes that people must find work after 2 years of aid, and it is for poor families to care for their children at home. It also promotes two-parent households. Greece had a similar situation to Italy, where the GMI was theoretical and vague, but its popularity has increased since the recession in Greece, and it has lots of support from the middle class. The evolution of GMI has shown that it is now more specific than before, and with more specific qualification requirements and specific programs that require people to work when they are using the benefit. GMI does not reduce the incentive to work. The cash given is actually more than the opportunities available in the job market. To counteract this effect of people not entering the workforce once they receive GMI, the programs often require those who are able to work to participate in job training programs to continue receiving aid. GMI has also been increasingly used in political debates, especially during times of economic recession. Now I'm going to hand it off to Corbin to talk about the impact of GMI.
Thank you for that. Now I'll be talking about the impact of the guaranteed minimum income on the labor supply. Here depicted, we have an individual's budget constraint where they receive a baseline GMI of $1,000. They have 110 hours of leisure, and they have a slope of -$5. So let's talk about the reservation wage of this individual. The slope is -5 in the initial, and it moves from -10. Now let's talk about what this means. Since there's no income stated, let's assume their income is $10. After this GMI is enacted, their income goes from $10 to $5 with the increase of that slope. So inevitably, this person will want to work less because the trade-off for an hour of leisure is greater than the previous. And they will end up making less money per hour of wage. So this person's reservation wage would have increased, meaning they'll require higher compensation for each hour worked, and they will probably not continue in the labor force. And of course, this varies from each person because we have different res wages. Next, I'll be talking about the substitution and income effect of the GMI, of course. So the substitution effect has the income rising, and therefore the marginal rate of substitution for the work and labor will end up increasing. This person is now willing to work more hours because their income is increasing, while the cost of leisure is also increasing, meaning it takes more income to take 1 hour of leisure off from working. And the income effect causes a scarcity in work because the person is making more money and they are willing to now not work as much and take more time into leisure. And of course, as always, this is different from person to person based on how the substitution effect and the income effect are weighted. For the total effect, it is going to be ambiguous at this point. And lastly, let's talk about the labor force. How is it affected from this GMI, from this guaranteed minimum income? Well, really, no one knows. There's really no generalized answer because in the masses, people have different opinions. It is based on solely preferences and the labor taxes that are increasing based on the GMI. Once you pass the threshold of the GMI, there are increased taxes and people are either more or less willing to work based on their preferences. So now, here that I've talked about the labor supply effect, here are the pros and cons of the general guaranteed minimum income with Matt Miller. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Corbin. So getting into the pros and cons here of a GMI and starting first with the pros. As we've seen over the past few decades and as we continue our transition into a more technological and globalized world economy, low-skilled jobs are going to be more and more commonly replaced by artificial intelligence, which ultimately leaves workers from entire industries displaced and with no income. So, for example, the rise of self-driving cars that we've seen over the past few years has the ability to compromise the trucking and taxi sectors, which employ more than 3.5 million American workers. So through that automation, all these people would be left without jobs and no income. But a GMI would help to offset this by providing supplemental income to the unemployed people who lost their jobs to technology. So secondly, a GMI would help to improve gender equality, especially in countries in which women have low levels of educational attainment and as a result of that, poor job opportunities. So providing income to these women would help financially liberate them and provide money for things like education and relieve them from being dependent on a male spouse. So one of the most direct benefits that a GMI would provide would be the general reduction of poverty. Obviously, this is one of the main purposes that this program serves, and in theory would eliminate homelessness and minimize wealth inequality in the areas that it's implemented. So this is relevant all around the world, and a global GMI would ultimately provide income to more than 3 billion people living under the severe poverty line. But of course, there's going to be negatives coinciding with this policy as well, that are both economic and behavioral. So intuitively, labor force participation rates for some people would likely fall a bit when you're providing them with free money. So GMI in itself would probably serve as a huge jump in one's reservation wage. So if that individual is unable to find work that exceeds that threshold, that reservation wage, they would likely stay out of the job market, but this is widely relying on preferences. The most fundamental issue, however, with the GMI is going to be the funding of it. So the cost of implementing a GMI in the United States would primarily be derived from taxpayer money, but this actual figure would be widely reliant on how many people actually qualify for the income. Presumably, as I mentioned earlier, as more people leave the labor force, this figure would continue to spiral higher and higher. But across the globe, when accounting for the 3 billion people living in extreme poverty, this figure would ultimately be an estimated 1% of the aggregate global income, which is a ton of money. And a consequence of adding this much money into a national economy is going to be the issue of inflation. As so many people are granted a higher purchasing power than what they previously held, that money is going to move around a whole lot quicker and more often, and inflation would likely increase at a pretty notable rate. But with all that being said, I'm going to pass it to Ben now to look into an empirical assessment of GMI policies.
Thanks, Matt. I'm here to talk about the overall assessment of GMI. GMI aims to tackle issues related to poverty and labor inequalities. GMI does a good job helping poverty levels by funding disabled workers, unemployed, sick, and retired people. A national survey of 10,000 GMI recipients was conducted and found that 34% of these households had disabled members and 65% had chronically sick members. In a similar study of 5 major cities, they found that 53% of all GMI recipients were unemployed and 12% were retired, chronically sick, or disabled. This shows that the requirements are aimed to help these types of people and discourage poverty and labor inequality. A simulation of GMI was conducted and found that 85% of transfers are awarded to poor people, and that 82% of these transfers effectively contribute to reducing the poverty gap. This shows GMI does a pretty good job at tackling the poverty gap. GMI is also present in a select amount of countries and states, and the requirements tend to vary based on location. The requirements that vary may include age, employment circumstances, income, certain health qualifications, and geographic location. A simulation was conducted and found that 4.8% of domestic households and 5.7% of the population are eligible to receive GMI. So GMI only helps a small portion of the population, but would definitely help reduce the poverty gap. GMI is a growing economic policy in several different places. China has seen a large increase in GMI recipients and locations. In 1995, only 12 cities had GMI, and by 1999, 668 cities had some form of GMI. This is illustrated by the graph below. You can clearly see an increase in cities and amount of funding given out. They both have been steadily increasing throughout different regions in China. One of the biggest issues with GMI is the funding for it. Funding GMI nationally will require increasing taxes for most people, and only a select amount of people actually benefit from it. Overall, GMI does a decent job of achieving its goals. Thanks for listening, and here's our works cited slide.